Welcome to the Passion Week meditations. This is Good Friday. I'm preparing this meditation on Thursday night, late on Thursday night, about the time during the Passion Week when Christ would have been betrayed by Judas and ushered by the high priest's soldiers back to be judged and ultimately found guilty and condemned for blasphemy. So, in this day, I had a good amount of my time spent looking at Mel Gibson's The Passion. I've looked at this film a number of times over many years. I used to, as the chaplain at VMI, show this film on Good Friday to cadets, usually in small groups. But on each occasion, having watched Mel Gibson's depiction of Jesus Christ um, on Thursday over to Friday in his crucifixion, um, became more than ever aware of the reality of the horror and suffering that Christ experienced in his being beaten and ultimately crucified. Um, I give a lot of thought to the specifics of this because in reading the scriptures without the historical context and without a real thorough knowledge of crucifixion and being flogged or scourged, um, I read over these passages. It's a part of the story of Easter, but in seeing it depicted in the Passion, it becomes ever so evident and overwhelmingly convincing and horribly real that Jesus Christ, for no fault, was horrendously treated by humanity. And it can hardly be put into words. In the few words that we have of his agony described in the scriptures, apart from knowing what this was like in the time of Christ's life, it's so easy to not fully appreciate and even comprehend the depth of the agony and suffering that Christ experienced in obedience to the Father. So he prayed, Father, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And from that point, beginning to embrace the sequence of events that would bring this circumstance, unwanted circumstance, on a Christ who embraced the will of his Father. But let me just share some thoughts along this line with you. The flogging, the scourging that was directed by Pilate, with the understanding that he would be beaten severely, but not unto death. To watch that depicted in the film, it is beyond our imagination to think about 40 minus 1 lashes with instruments that were intended to significantly tear up the body and remove skin and flesh and leave a person experiencing terrible, terrible pain. And to watch Christ endure that, while we don't have details that would describe it completely, the picture provided by this film based on the historical study, it's just terrible, absolutely terrible. And then to watch Christ be brought back to Pilate, where he doesn't want to be guilty of crucifying him, condemning him to death. He comes up with a plan to offer up Barabbas, a murderer, a criminal, in exchange for Jesus, that he might go free. But the crowd calls for the release of Barabbas over Jesus, so that Christ, who is guiltless, without fault, is given up in order to have Barabbas released. And just the total unfairness of that exchange, It's so reprehensible. So Barabbas goes free, having been found guilty of crimes and murder, and Jesus, who is innocent, is then given over to be crucified. And then with his beaten body, embracing the cross, being mocked and ridiculed and spit upon, crown of thorns upon his head, pressed down upon his brow, bleeding profusely, carrying this cross, not just a short distance, but all the way through the city, all the way out the city gates, all the way down the roads that lead to Golgotha, all the way up the hill to the skull. This is not a short journey. This is not an easy movement. This is like horribly difficult. And for Christ to endure all that, it almost would cause you to feel like nails being driven into his hands and into his feet is the lesser suffering compared to everything else that he experiences. So then as he is on the cross, again being ridiculed, if you are the Messiah, come down, save yourself. He makes statements of, God, forgive them, they don't know what they do. John, behold your mother. Mother, behold your son. I thirst. But then he ultimately says, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? It gives the impression as though Jesus might have been holding out hope that perhaps the Father would in fact intervene at the very end, after all of his suffering, after the scourging, after the ridicule, after being spat upon, mocked, horribly treated, that maybe somehow God the Father would yet intervene on his behalf. And he doesn't. And he doesn't. So here's Christ, the Son of God, forsaken on the tree, the same Christ who at a time when Joseph had been placed in prison and had done no wrong, and for 2 years he's forsaken, forgotten, but God intervenes and he's remembered and he's released from prison. Or what about the case of Daniel in the lion's den, where God intervenes and he's not forsaken, but he's rescued? Or Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego being in the fiery furnace, prepared to be delivered up to God, and yet not forsaken. The fourth man, Christ, appears in the fire. Or Hannah, who felt forsaken because she was without child, but yet God intervenes and she births Samuel. Or Naomi, who lost her husband and lost both of her sons to death and feels like she's been forsaken, but Ruth finds grace with Boaz and is taken in, and so Naomi eventually is cared for. She's not forsaken. And yet Jesus is forsaken. The God that he's obeyed, the God that he's loved, the God that he's served, the God that he's trusted. Now in this moment, I am going to die. My God, why have you forsaken me? I was reminded at that expression of a time in my own life. I was out of the Army. I was through seminary. Catherine and I were with a church plant in Cape Cod, and it was a struggle. It was a tough time, very hard, very challenging for us. Many things that God did, but financially, it was a struggle. At the end of the first year, I had been helped by one of the elders, an older man than myself, in terms of getting my taxes paid. So he found somebody that could advise me. In the past, I'd always done W-2s. The Army had always kept about the income that needed to be paid toward taxes, and it was all done, taken care of. On this occasion, my elder, Tony, took me to meet with his friend who helped advise in taxes, and I sat down with him with my tax records, and he said to me, well, how have you done? Where are your quarterly payments? I said, quarterly payments? He said, yeah, you're you're considered self-employed now, and so you're to set aside 1/4 of your income, or set aside the equivalent of a tax with each quarter out of your income. And I'm saying, I didn't know that. I didn't know I was supposed to do that. By the time the meeting was done, I realized I owed a few $1,000s on my income, which barely met our needs in terms of feeding the family and paying our rent. I remember Tony driving me back to my home and getting out of the car and going to the house. And I think Catherine was at work teaching, and I just was beside myself. I thought, my God, what am I going to do? I owe thousands of dollars. Where am I going to come up with thousands of dollars? I barely make enough to keep my family fed doing this job as a church planter. I left the house. I lived about a mile from the ocean or the bay at Cape Cod, and started walking toward the ocean, and just crying out to God as I walk by myself. And as I'm part way in the mile to the ocean, it starts raining, and it starts raining down on me. And I'm going, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I'm thinking, I've served you. I've been ministering to these people. I'm trying to share your gospel. And now I'm in this terrible dilemma. And why, God, have you forsaken me? Well, it began to rain so hard that I turned around and went back to the house. And just as I got to the house, I opened the back door, stepped into the kitchen, and the phone was ringing. I went over and picked up the phone, and it was Dick Salvatore, who is the only other elder in our church. And he was at work, but he was calling me, and he was saying, Pastor, I'm here at work, but I just felt the strongest impression to call you. I just felt like God was saying to me, call the pastor and tell him, I have not forsaken you. I am with you. Well, I couldn't believe it. He had no way of knowing. Only God knew that I just cried out to him, why have you forsaken me? And within 30 minutes, as I arrived back home, at that moment, the phone rings. And through our elder, prophetically, God says to me, I have not forsaken you. I am with you. The good news is that Jesus Christ on Good Friday died in our place. He paid the full depth of the wage we owe for our wrongdoing, our rebellion, our resistance, our horrible natures. And because of that, we can have forgiveness. Christ was forsaken in our place for us. He paid the price. He gave his life for our sin to bring us into a relationship with God. I'm so aware today of my sin in comparison to the holiness of Christ completely giving himself, his body, his blood, his breath on my behalf. I am awestruck at the wonder of this sacrifice. He paid our price. We are not forsaken. Let's pray. Father, may the truth of Christ on the cross be true for us today. I can't forsake my wife. She's calling me, so I've got to head out and give her a hand. God bless you.